The Bible is one book, one story told in 2 acts and 7 scenes. The prologue.
The prologue introduces us to the main character of the story, God, who sets us out on our mission for the world to create, to be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth with his glory. Then we are introduced to man who rebels against the missions of sin. God is gracious and kills an animal to clothe the man in grace and cover their shame.
Then we fill the earth with evil instead of the glory of God. So God chooses Noah to build an ark to save a chosen few from God's anger. Then man builds and fills a city instead of the earth, and they fill the city with their own glory. So God comes into the city, confuses their language, and scatters them, making them fill the earth. The patriarchs.
Next, we meet Abraham, a man who God calls to make a great nation. The promise that he will be in a blessed land, a blessed nation, and blessed are all given to Abraham. Isaac, Abraham's son, was his pride and joy, and God asked Abraham if he would sacrifice his only son. God provided a substitution ram to save Isaac's life.
Jacob, Isaac's son, wrestles with God and is given the name Israel, meaning those who wrestle with God. Joseph, Jacob's son, saved his brothers, who did not deserve to be saved, by being in Egypt. The Passover. Israel is in Egypt and is able to be fruitful and multiply, but is unable to fill the earth.
So God calls Moses from a burning bush to save God's people from their slavery. God calls 10 plagues upon Egypt to show his power over their false gods and to get his people out of slavery.
The final plague is the killing of the firstborn son of every Egyptian family. Israel is spared by marking lamb's blood on their door frames and still celebrates the Passover with the feast.
The pillar. In the pillar, God leads his people through the wilderness to Mount Sinai, where God gives them the law. The law tells them how they are set apart by God to be a blessing to all people. They then built the tabernacle, the place where God would dwell with his people, and they built the Ark of the Covenant, where was the throne of God. God's desire was to dwell with his people.
The promise.
God placed Joshua as the leader of Israel. Joshua points us to the future Yeshua, Jesus, who will lead God's people.
The period of the Judges shows us how Israel, even though they were called by God, their hearts were not always after the things of God.
The kings came next and unified Israel under Saul and David and Solomon. Solomon had a divided heart between God and pagan gods, even though he built the temple. Solomon left a divided kingdom, but a kingdom that was fruitful and able to multiply.
The proximity. God is close to his people through their trials. The kingdom is divided, but God is still there. The prophets speak God's words to men and predict the coming exile. Israel is exiled, and prophets speak of a future return, which does eventually come. God used the exile to fill the earth with his glory again, making the rulers of Babylon bow to their knees.
The silence.
God is silent for 400 years.
And then we are introduced to the fulfillment of the Old Testament, Jesus. Jesus is God, so Jesus is also the main character of the story.
Jesus' sacrifice covers us in our sin. Jesus is the vessel to save us from God's anger.
Jesus brings language together when every knee will bow and every tongue will confess his lordship.
Jesus is the firstborn of God's chosen people.
Jesus is the substitutionary atonement.
Jesus is the one who comes down to us.
Jesus is the one who saves those who don't deserve it.
Jesus is the one who allowed us to be fruitful.
Jesus is the one who calls out his people for salvation.
Jesus performs miracles of healing instead of bringing plagues of destruction.
Jesus is the firstborn, killed for our salvation.
Jesus is our head, our leader.
Jesus fulfills the law. Jesus tabernacled among us on earth.
Jesus dwelt with his people.
Jesus leads his church.
Jesus turns our hardened hearts toward God.
Jesus is our perfect king.
Jesus is close to us in trial.
Jesus speaks to us as the final prophet.
Jesus came to his own, and his own did not receive him.
Jesus will return. We will live in eternal shalom, eternal peace with Jesus forever.